After eating a pair of fluffernutters and taking a dip in the pool, welcome to episode 4 of Nihon no Konyo Henshokai. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the Nintendo 64. This is the 1996 successor to the Super Nintendo. It was released in Japan initially and then brought to North America just a few months later. The 64 in the title refers to memory storage. So on the NES in the 8-bit era, you were able to hold 2 to the 8th different values for something. In the 16-bit era on the Super Nintendo, you were able to hold 2 to the 16th different values for something. But on the Nintendo 64, you're able to hold 2 to the 64th different values for something, which, to comprehend how large that is, try putting it into your calculator, you're going to get an overflow error. So there was a lot that the Nintendo 64 was capable of doing over its predecessors. And that sounds like a great way to start and hear how successful the N64 was, but it was anything but successful. This was 2 years late to the video game scene in its generation, as the PS1 was released in 1994, and because of how late it was released and a variety of other things, the PS1 dominated the market. So before even releasing, Sony was kicking butt with the PS1, and then this came late and just didn't really make a dent. People that wanted to play games played them on PS1. A lot of games that were released on PS1, a lot of games that were released on N64 were also released on PS1. So the N64 began the shift for about 2 generations where Sony definitely gripped the market between the PS1 and PS2. But even though it didn't do well, and even though just its market stance made it seem like a total failure, there's a lot going for the N64. For one, it's one of the first few systems to have 4 controller ports, so it definitely encouraged multiplayer. But not just that, because the games on the N64 are absolutely iconic. The library is very small because the N64 didn't last very long, but the games that did release, again, are absolutely iconic. Here's to name a few. I'm not going to show all of them, but here they are. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, Castlevania 64, Conker's Bad Fur Day, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, F-Zero X, both of which are racing games, GoldenEye 007, which is, if not the greatest licensed game of all time, one of the greatest licensed games of all time, Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Mario Kart 64, another racing game, but the first cult Mario Kart. People rarely go back to Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo, but they will always go back to Mario Kart 64. Mario Party got a start on the N64 with Mario Party 1, 2, and 3. Mario Sports gained a lot of character on the system. So, namely in Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, there's a lot of gimmicks and novelty to playing those games. So, a lot of Mario Sports games we get now really started to do that on the N64. The first Paper Mario was released on N64. There's Pilot Wing 64. Pokemon got its first few spin-offs on the N64 in the names of Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2, as well as Pokemon Snap. There's Star Fox 64. The first Super Smash Bros. Was on 64. And last but not least, Super Mario 64 changed 3D gameplay forever by revolutionizing 3D graphics and gameplay. So if it wasn't for those games, the N64 would have failed a lot harder than what it actually did. Another thing that set the N64 aside from the PS1 is its variety in hardware. So on the NES, on the Super Nintendo, and even on the PS1, those systems are kind of boring looking. They're gray. They only had one updated version, but the N64 had a ton of different console variants and different console colors. Had a ton of different controller colors. So many so that I have 5 N64s in 4 different colors, and I have 11 different colored controllers. So to say that the N64 is doesn't have any variety in terms of hardware is a blatant lie. And that's also one of the things that makes collecting for the N64 so much fun. Another thing we're going to talk about is the 64DD. So the 64DD was an add-on to the Nintendo 64. A lot like the Famicom Disk System to the Famicom. A lot like the canceled CD-ROM add-on to the Super Famicom that we talked about in the first few episodes. The 64DD did release, but only in Japan, and it's super obscure, didn't do well, and it's actually super expensive now. I think to buy one on eBay right now, it's $1,400, which is crazy. Very last thing to talk about before we get into the games is region locking. So the N64 is region locked, but only by the physical design of the bottoms of the cartridges. So when you put a game into its own region, it fits snugly, but when you try and fit it into another region, it physically will not go in. Now, this is really easy to fix. You open up the N64 and take out the tray, put in a tray that fits all of them, and you're done. So very easy to fix region locking on the N64. But without further ado, let's get into the games. So first game is Bokujo Monogatari 2, better known as Harvest Moon 64. This is a 1999 farm sim developed and published by Victor Interactive Software, where you play as a guy who's reviving an abandoned farm. It's a pretty typical farm sim with day-night cycles, stamina, resource management, but it also added features like being able to get pets, get married, have kids, and it's overall just an improvement from the original Harvest Moon released on the Super Nintendo. So this was brought to North America in 1999 and the Wii U Virtual Console in 2017, both of which were published by Natsume. But this is the third game in the Harvest Moon series, and it helped spawn that franchise, the Harvest Moon franchise. But interestingly, the Harvest Moon franchise would become the Story of Season franchise. So Harvest Moon then is Story of Seasons. Now, I have two of the Story of Seasons games on Switch. I didn't know that before I bought them, but Harvest Moon still exists. So even though Harvest Moon still exists, it's not the same Harvest Moon as this one and those Switch games. Also, if you've ever played Rune Factory or heard of Rune Factory, that is another spin-off of the Harvest Moon series. So pretty big franchise with connections to a lot of different franchises. So pretty interesting. Next, we talked about Bomberman in the Famicom episode. Bomberman is a series of action maze puzzle type games. And in this episode, we have Bomberman Hero Million Ojo Osukui, better known as just Bomberman Hero here in North America. This is a 1998 3D platformer developed by AI and published by Hudson, and it's just a continued growth from 16-bit Bomberman. One interesting part is that there is no multiplayer, despite the encouragement from the N64's hardware. In this game, you play as Bomberman as he goes to rescue a princess who she herself stole information and got captured. But a very interesting part of this game is that you get ratings based on your completeness for each level. And based on those ratings, you're able to unlock minigames. So there's a lot of ways to unlock more content in Bomberman Hero. This was brought to North America the same year, but was published by Nintendo. And it was also brought to the Wii Virtual Console in 2011. So another game for the Bomberman series. I think I own both Bomberman games in Japanese on N64. So that's pretty cool too. Next is Choro Q64. This is a 1998 customizable racing game developed by Locomotive and published by Takara. Another racing game on N64. This is the first N64 games in the Choro series, but the series goes as far back as 1984 on the MSX, which was a home computer, and it went all the way up until 2012 with a mobile release. But in this era, they had a ton of PS1 releases, and we only got one N64 release. This game is kind of like Mario Kart 64 and South Park Rally, which is another N64 racing game. And it's as if those two games met Simpsons Hit and Run. That's at least what I got from the gameplay. So it looks pretty neat. So that's pretty cool. This came to North America as Penny Racers in 1999, at the time published by THQ. And the Choro series came to North America a couple more times, not under Choro, but under the titles Gadget Racers and Road Trip on different systems. And even though it's not really my cup of tea, it's still interesting to see how this series has grown and came to North America in other ways. Also, that label is like fantastic. Next is another series we've talked about. We talked about Doraemon on the Famicom and Super Famicom, and now we have Doraemon on the N64. This is Doraemon Nobita to 3 Tsu no Sairaiseki, or translated as Doraemon, Nobita, and the 3 Fairy Spirit Stones. So we talked about Doraemon. Doraemon is a franchise that began as a manga in 1969 and grew so big that Japan has called it an anime ambassador. So that's pretty interesting to set the stage. This is a 1997 3D platformer developed and published by Epoch that plays a lot like Super Mario 64, but you play as Doraemon and the kids as they try to receive those 3 fairy stones that were stolen by the evil king. Most also notably, on Game FAQs, it notes that it was canceled for North America, which is really interesting because had this come to North America, you have to wonder if Doraemon would have taken off the same way and where we would be in terms of anime had we been exposed to Doraemon so early. So that's just pretty interesting. Another Doraemon game in the series. Next is another game we talked about in the Famicom episode. We talked about Excite Bike. Excite Bike is a motocrossing game that, when brought to North America, it was a black box release, so it has a very classic atmosphere behind it. But most notably, the side-scrolling technology that was used in this game helped develop Super Mario Bros. So without Excite Bike, we might not get Super Mario Bros. But on the N64, we have Excite Bike 64. So this should have been in the intro as well. I didn't want to give anything away, but this is another really high-selling title for the N64. This is a 2000 sequel to the first game developed by Left Field Productions and published by Nintendo. It's the first in 3D. It's a fleshed-out version of the first game, and like other racing games, it's got a season or a campaign mode. It's got time trial mode. So it kind of just goes along with what we've been talking about racing games. Which is also kind of funny. The first time I plugged this in to test to make sure it was working, even on a low TV setting, it was so loud. It made my ears bleed with how ridiculously loud it was. I'm guessing just because of like the motocross and the mics. So that was kind of funny. But this came to North America the same year, also as Excite Bike 64, but also very interestingly that it was brought to Switch Online just like a week ago. So if you don't want to get the N64 games, you can play it on Switch Online right now. Lastly, it also received a sequel as Excite Truck on the Wii. Excite Truck on the Wii is nothing like Excite Bike and Excite Bike 64. If anything, it seems more like a shovel title, but still pretty interesting that the series did continue in other ways. Next is Fushigi no Dungeon, Furai no Shiren 2, Oni Shurai Shirenjo, or better known as Shiren the Wanderer 2, Shiren's Castle and the Oni Invasion. This is a 2000 roguelike RPG developed by Chunsoft and published by Nintendo. It's the second game in the Shiren the Wanderer series after a Super Famicom game that was also curiously titled Shiren the Wanderer 2. So a little confusing there. But this is part of an overarching series called Mystery Dungeon. So Mystery Dungeon began with Tornico, and Tornico is a kind of a Dragon Quest spin-off in the same like roguelike RPG fashion. And it's crossed over with a bunch of other series like Shiren the Wanderer, even though Shiren the Wanderer is kind of like inside Mystery Dungeon. But most notably, you might have heard of Mystery Dungeon in the Pokemon franchise. So there's a Pokemon Mystery Dungeon on the Game Boy Advance. There are Mystery Dungeons on the DS. I believe there's one on the 3DS. And there's also one on Switch. So if you want a different take on the Pokemon formula in terms of more of like a roguelike, give the Mystery Dungeon games a shot, especially the one on Switch. Your goal in this game, however, is to build a castle and protect it in dungeon battles. It was planned for the 64DD. It's the first in the Shiren the Wanderer series to be in 3D. And also very interesting, it had a it had a fan translation in 2021, 21 years after the game was released. And the most recent game, it's a port of the DS game, but the DS game is a port of this game. So the Super Famicom game became the DS game. The DS game became this one. So different ways to play Shiren the Wanderer on modern systems. I think Shiren the Wanderer is kind of, it's a really cool name to begin with, but it's kind of an interesting franchise, and I should definitely give the Switch game a shot at some point. Next is Itoi Shigesato no Bass Tsuri No. 1 Ketaiban. So this game was released in 2000, but the original Itoi Shigesato no Bass Tsuri No. 1 Ketaiban was released in 1997 on the Super Famicom. It's a fishing game developed by HAL Laboratory and published by Nintendo, where you play as Shigesato Itoi as he fishes and participates in quizzes. That cartridge, interestingly, had Satellaview capability. Not to get too far deep into it, basically, Satellaview was a system to kind of get an early version of DLC. So you could have a Satellaview cartridge, broadcast waves would be sent, and you can play different things on your Satellaview cartridges, which is pretty interesting. This game, however, is a definitive port released in 2000, developed by DICE, but again published by Nintendo for the N64. So now you might be wondering, who's this guy, Shigesato Itoi? Why is it such a big deal? Well, you've probably heard of Shigesato Itoi from the Mother and Earthbound series. So if you ever played that cult franchise, it was written by Shigesato Itoi. So that's a pretty big connection. Kind of funny that, the Earthbound creator made a fishing game, or had a fishing game made about him. Just kind of funny. Another interesting thing to mention is that he's not only credited on the Mother games, he's also credited on Monopoly on the Super Famicom, Monopoly 1 and Monopoly 2. So that's also kind of silly, but also very interesting. Next, let's talk a little bit about Rare. So Rare is a UK developer that grew to prominence on the Super Nintendo with the Donkey Kong Country series, kind of reviving the Donkey Kong name. But they were very, very prominent on the N64. Just to name a few games that Rare developed on the N64, there's Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, Diddy Kong Racing, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and also GoldenEye 007. So all those games I listed in the original first title games in the intro as some of the best-selling titles of all time. So that's a big deal. But here we have Mickey No Racing Challenge USA, or better known as Mickey Speedway USA here in North America. So this is a 2000 racing game developed by Rare and published by Nintendo under the Disney Interactive license. And all it is, it's a racing game, another racing game. On the N64, you're playing as Mickey Mouse characters from that universe, and you're driving through American locations, which is kind of cool. But very interesting. The game initially was released in North America in 2000 and then brought to Japan in early 2001. So a rare case of an American game coming first. There's also a 2001 Game Boy Color port, but that game never even left North America. It never went to Japan. So that's also kind of interesting. It's a funny game with a weird release history. So of course it's Disney, so can't go wrong with Disney. Next is kind of an interesting game that I don't have a whole lot to say about. The things surrounding it are frankly more interesting in my opinion. But here we have Ogre Battle 64, Person of Lordly Caliber. This is a 1999 tactical RPG developed by Quest and published by Nintendo, where you build up an army in a civil war. The game has 3 different endings based on your chaos frame, based on how you play. And it's actually the 3rd game in the Ogre series. The first one is not that one. First one is Densetsu no Ogre Battle, the March of the Black Queen, released on the Super Famicom in 1993, and Tactics Ogre, Let Us Cling Together, released also on the Super Famicom in 1995. But this game came to North America in 2000 and was released worldwide on the Wii Virtual Console in 2010 and on the Wii U Virtual Console in 2017. As far as I know, it is not on Switch Online just yet, but based on its track record, it might be there soon. Another game that was planned for the 64 DD. And why I bought this? Well, Ogre's an interesting name. I'm going to let this explain the rest. So that's that. Next game is Onegai Monsters. This is before I talk about the game specifically, in the late 90s, a lot of games were trying to capitalize on the Pokemon formula where you catch monsters and level them up and grow them. Talked about it a couple times with Robopon if you've seen videos in the past. But this one is also a 1999 monster catching game developed and published by Bottom Up, where you send monsters out to grow. You don't even adventure with them, you just send them out. And it kind of sounds like Pokemon. The monsters can be bred, they can evolve. There's 500 of them for you to collect. And the story also begins when the boy turns 10. Literally Ash Ketchum. So, it's just a little guy on the cartridge, which is why I bought it, but still very interesting to see another example of a series that tried to emulate Pokemon. That didn't go well. Next, another series we've talked about Puyo Puyo on the Game Boy. Puyo Puyo is a Tetris-like series that began in the early 90s and was just ported all over the place. And it most recently gained steam here in the US as Puyo Puyo Tetris and Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, but its roots stem far deeper than just those 2 games. here we have Puyo Puyo Sun 64. So this was released in 1997, but the original Puyo Puyo Sun was released in 1996. Again, a Tetris-like, developed and published by Compile. Initially released in arcades, but again, it's one of those games that was ported all over the place. It was ported to the N64 in 1997. It was also ported to the PS1 and Saturn in 1997, and also on the Game Boy Color in 1998. Now, it's a Puyo Puyo game, so that's why I bought it. But during research, this is what Wikipedia had to say about it. Satan has used special magic to make the sun bigger on a remote island, hoping to create a paradise where he can relax surrounded by girls in bikinis. Not what I was going for, but still pretty funny. Next is Star Wars Taikoku no Kage, better known as Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. This is a 1996 third-person shooter developed by LucasArts and published by Nintendo. It was initially released in North America and then brought to Japan in 1997. It's exactly what you'd expect from Star Wars, but quite frankly, I can't say a lot about this game. I don't like Star Wars, but it was cheap, so I bought it. That's a bad habit. Next is Yuchanin-chan no Ono no Challenger Denryu Ira Ira Bo. Or translated as Yuchanin-chan's Flaming Challenger Irritating Electric Stick. So this is a 1997 puzzle game developed by Yuke's and published by Hudson that is based on a Japanese show's Electric Maze game segment. And there's different modes to make the game harder, but based on gameplay, you can kind of envision it's kind of like Operation or one of those carnival games where you have to like move like a hoop across a certain thing without touching something that goes in the middle. That's essentially what this game is. Not much to say of it past that, but when I was reading a guide about the game, the guy said it took him 10 hours to beat, and the speedrun for this game is only 7 minutes. So definitely kind of interesting, and I don't know, if you're really into that carnival game, this might be the game for you. Next is a game that is a little interesting. So this one's not a new game. This is Wave Race 64 Kawasaki Jet Ski. This is a 1996 water racing game developed and published by Nintendo that was originally thought to be F-Zero on water. So if you're unfamiliar with F-Zero, F-Zero is futuristic racing, began on the Super Nintendo, but has been dormant since the GameCube. So that's kind of what Nintendo was going for here, just on water. It initially began on the 64DD, but it's a lot like other racing games we've talked about. It's got time trials, it's got a campaign, you're just riding a jet ski. So this was brought to North America in 1997 as Wave Race 64, but the interesting part is that after the North American version released, Japan only got Wave Race 64, the Rumble Pack version. So exactly what it sounds like. The Rumble Pack was a controller add-on that literally made your controller vibrate. So it went Japanese release, American release, and then Japanese release with Rumble Pack support. And that's the new one. That came out in 1997 versus 1996. So the game also has been a little all over the place for Nintendo. It was released on the Wii Virtual Console in 2007, on the Wii U Virtual Console in 2016, joined Switch Online in 2022, and the last Wave Race game, I believe, was released in 2001, which was a sequel on the GameCube, I believe as a launch title for the GameCube. So that's pretty interesting too. Next is Yoshi's Story. It's a 1997 2.5D side-scrolling platformer developed and published by Nintendo, where you play as a bunch of Yoshis in this very cute storybook world that was cast by Baby Bowser. He wanted to rain on their happy lifestyle and cast a spell on them, and then they ended up in a storybook, which is kind of funny. But it is very, very pretty. 2.5D is simply a 2D game, but the sprites, the backgrounds, that kind of thing are all in 3D. So even though it's, side-scrolling, it's still kind of like 3D. So 2.5D. Also another game that began on the 64DD, released on virtual consoles all over the place. 2007 on Wii, 2016 on Wii U, and 2021 on Switch Online. So it's a Yoshi game. It's adorable. Great reason to buy it. So last but not least, it's a game I'm not necessarily fond of, but it's a game that I find has a very, very fascinating release history. So that is Dobutsu no Mori, or better known as Animal Forest. So don't jump to the punchline here. So this is a 2001 social sim developed and published by Nintendo that began the Animal Crossing franchise. So Animal Crossing, you've probably heard of it mostly as Animal Crossing New Horizons, which is a game on the Switch that has sold a lot of copies and got a lot of people through the pandemic. But it started on the N64 with Dobutsu no Mori. So you play as a new resident who is helping build up a town in a never-ending adventure, and that's kind of Animal Crossing's like thing, where you just kind of do quests, you do random jobs, and the game never really ends. You just make the game more. And its legacy is absolutely insane. Animal Crossing has reached a lot of people. So, but here's the really interesting release history. So we started with Animal Forest on the N64 in April of 2001. It was one of the last games released on the N64. It was initially tried to be a 64DD game, but that's this game, and this never came to North America. But only 7 months after this release, this game was ported to the GameCube as Dobutsu no Mori Plus. Now that game on GameCube would then release in North America as the original Animal Crossing on GameCube, the first Animal Crossing game we ever got, and that released in September 2002. So this game had some updates, had some improvements as Dobutsu no Mori Plus. Dobutsu no Mori Plus had more improvements, more updates, and came to North America as Animal Crossing. And that's not where it stops. But one very interesting thing to note, one of those improvements, was that Animal Crossing is kind of like an NES emulator. There are some games that are unlocked right from the very beginning, but as you complete more quests, as you complete more jobs, you are able to unlock more NES games. So if you wanted to play classic NES games, you could do it through Animal Crossing. But that's not where it stops. Nintendo was so impressed with the translation work and the added features to Animal Crossing in North America that it then released as another new game that should be in its own GameCube episode. But Animal Crossing was brought back to Japan as Dobutsu no Mori E Plus in June 2003 with even more added extra content. So it went Animal Forest, Dobutsu no Mori Plus with added features, Animal Crossing in North America with added features, and then back to Japan as Dobutsu no Mori E Plus in June 2003. Again, each with its own updates, which is really interesting. So I'm not a huge Animal Crossing fan. It's just not really my game. But I know a lot of people like it, and that release history is really, really interesting. So that's going to do it for this episode. If there are any games you thought were interesting or you want to see gameplay for, I put a bunch of links in the description in a Google Doc. But also, if I said anything wrong or if you feel like there's anything I should have added, please put it in the comments. I want to learn as much about these games as I can. And I hope you learned something. So in the meantime, play a lot of games, and I hope to see you next week.